Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation at the Leventhal Map and Education Center. I'm Garrett Nelson. I'm head curator here at the Leventhal Center, and we're really excited to be joined today by a really exciting team of designers, fellows, activists, and scholars in our Harvard Climate Justice Design Fellowship virtual showcase. Before we start today's programs, I want to say a couple of brief words about the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including many difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston, where I'm sitting right now, is the ancestral and current home to indigenous peoples, including the Mashpee and Aquinnah Wampanoag tribes, the Nipmuc nations, and here on the historic Shawmut Peninsula, the Massachusetts people. We have folks joining from all across North America today, from places with their own complicated and contested histories. The maps that are in our collections here at the Boston Public Library bear witness not only to these histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts that range from labor struggles to racial segregations. Through all of our programs here at the Leventhal Center, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. And today we're really delighted to be able to share maps that are themselves attempting to exert real effects on the present day with critical approaches to mapping issues of environmental justice and injustice. Today's presentation comes just after we've closed an 8-month exhibition about environmental justice here at the Map Center called More or Less in Common, Environment and Justice in the Human Landscape. Our exhibition explored stories about how the environment has structured and worsened environmental inequities over the course of centuries, but also crucially, how maps can be used to speak back to systems of power and injustice and to both imagine and create more just futures. We are really lucky to have our neighbors at Harvard exploring some of these same topics with their Climate Justice Design Fellowship. And for the next month and a half through March 1st, in our classroom here at the Central Library, where I'm sitting right now, we'll be displaying work from the Climate Justice Design Fellows projects available for anybody to come in and see. Our gallery and learning spaces are free to the public, and we're open 6 days a week. You can visit our website at leventhalmap.org to learn more about visiting the center and more about our programs. I'm going to turn it over to the team from Harvard for most of today's presentation. So I'd like to begin by welcoming George Saranicolau, who's the Executive Director of the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability and the Assistant Provost for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard University. Hi, George, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Garrett. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to speak with you for just a moment to tell you about the Salata Institute and why we were so pleased to support the Climate Justice Design Fellowship. So first, some background. Harvard created the Salata Institute last year to strengthen the university's contribution to addressing climate change. The charge encompasses education, research, and public engagement so that the knowledge that Harvard produces can inform decision-making in the real world. Our mission formally is to collaborate with colleagues across the entire university to develop and promote durable, effective, and equitable solutions to the climate change challenges that confront us all. Equity is integral to our work. There can be no real solution to the climate problem without equity. And while that's an important statement, it's also just a starting point. Doing the difficult work of improving equity requires making different decisions about what we do and how we do it. Data is an essential part of that transformation, I think. The projects about which we're about to hear demonstrate the power of data to drive greater equity. The projects also speak to the potential of universities like Harvard to support communities in pursuing climate justice. The Salata Institute is proud to have supported the inaugural cohort of the Climate Justice Design Fellows. I'm eager to hear from the fellows themselves, so let me advance our program by turning it over to Nathan Sanders. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, George. And thank you to the Salata Institute for making our program possible and for supporting our fellows. And thank you, Garrett, for hosting us at the Leventhal Center today and in your exhibition. My name is Nathan Sanders, and together with Jill DeSimone, I'm one of the co-directors of the Climate Justice Design Fellowship. I'm a data scientist, and my work focuses on creating open technologies that help vulnerable communities and all stakeholders participate in the analysis and development of public policy. And I'm an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. We are so excited to share with you today the creations of our CJDF fellows, who have been working intensively now for over 6 months to find ways to use technological tools to empower their communities across the nation. If we could please show my screen, we have some information that you can use to follow along with us today. I hope as our fellows present, you'll see that their work embodies the mission of the Climate Justice Design Fellowship, which is to empower environmental justice advocates and public servants from across the United States to design and build accessible data tools that help them promote equity and justice in their own communities. So in just a moment, each of our fellows is going to tell you about their work, and we're going to try and refrain from just showing you a slideshow. Instead, our fellows are going to give you a narrative description of what they've done and what they've learned. But many of our fellows do have web materials linked here that you can follow along with as we present and after today's session. So if you go to climatefellowship.org, you can see some information about each of our fellows' projects. And if you click through the links here, you can go to our fellows' own websites. With that, I'll hand it over to my co-director, Jill, to tell you a little bit more about our fellows. Jill, I don't think we can hear you.
No, can you hear me now? Hi, sorry, thank you. I'll start again. I'm Jill. As Nathan mentioned, I'm the co-director of the Climate Justice Design Fellowship. I also want to thank Nathan for embarking on this with me. And I want to thank George and Garrett for hosting us today. I'm a landscape architect and professor at the University of Connecticut, where I'm interested in how we can promote justice work through design. But I have to say the best part of starting this fellowship has really been meeting our 7 fellows, working with them and our incredible mentors and project teams. So we're delighted that you're going to have a chance to hear from them today. But I'm going to just introduce them all briefly so that you have the bulk of the time to hear from them. I have to say they're 7 amazing individuals doing great work in very diverse disciplines and geographies. Alexa White is a scientist in Michigan who's a leader in the environmental justice space and has been thinking about how EJ screening tools can measure cumulative impacts across space and time rather than site by site, metric by metric. Jax Tran is a clinically trained and trauma-informed social worker, human rights activist, and community leader in New Orleans, creating an ongoing storytelling and reimagining data equity project, looking to capture Asian American diasporic stories in New Orleans and the Gulf South. It brings me a smile to talk about them. Jarisha Brannon is a civil and environmental engineer and climate leader from Portland, Oregon, who's been layering community stories with data about extreme heat events to create a fuller representation of how these issues impact the BIPOC community in the greater Portland area. Laura Robinson is a landscape designer and arborist in the Washington, D.C. area, fighting for more resilient climate resilient schoolyards. Her project, called Schools Need Trees, provides metrics and resources to school administrators, teachers, students, and families in the Prince George's County, Maryland School District. Carlos Clausel is an Afro-Caribbean climate leader from Puerto Rico and based in Philadelphia. He focuses on implementing community-centered processes to advance climate equity, and his project uses an equity lens to examine blue lining as a concept. You'll hear more from him about it, aiming to develop a definition that responds to the needs of community of color. Dominique Thomas, who can't be here today, is a grassroots organizer, Afrofuturist trainer, and researcher based in Harlem, New York. She's using a Black feminist, ecological, and Afrofuturist praxis to consider what climate reparation may look like in Harlem and how these practices can help build the necessary community power to win a climate future grounded in abolition. And Idalmius Vaquero, also not here today, is a lawyer and advocate working on behalf of communities burdened by pollution in Southeast Los Angeles. She's using custom developed maps to understand the proximity of hazardous waste facilities and cleanup sites to schools as a tool to support much needed policy change in California. And there's something that Idalmi said at our opening meeting back in June that stuck with me throughout the fellowship, that this for her has been an intensely personal work. And I think that rings true for many of our fellows, and it's what makes it so rich. And I can't help but feel grateful to have been trusted to support this work over these past 6 months. But I also want to acknowledge that these are long-term important projects, that they'll live beyond this short fellowship. Yes, perhaps as these websites and papers, but more importantly, as ongoing work that will lead to community and policy change, to physical change, to reimagining data, to organizing, to storytelling. These are really just seeds, and they're these seeds that we're excited to share with you today. So without taking more time, I'm going to invite Alexa to share a few thoughts about her work and experience.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Jill. This fellowship was profound for me. A lot of the motivation for this work was from my hometown of Newark, New Jersey. Throughout the project, it was also inspired by a lot of the US federal government's initiative for environmental justice. So the Justice 40 initiative declared that there was a goal to have 40% of the overall benefits be kind of streamlined into environmental justice processes and projects. And so throughout my time as a graduate student, I've always been interested in environmental justice screening tools and metrics. It was really important for me to kind of blend my own education as an ecologist, my background as kind of an EJ activist, as well as figuring out kind of where I could have the greatest impact. And so the New Jersey environmental justice motivations have largely been behind figuring out exactly how EJ map, so New Jersey's environmental justice screening tool, can be enhanced. And according to many of the methodologies, so there are national environmental justice screening tools as well as state environmental justice screening tools. The biggest issue has been figuring out how to handle the issue of cumulative impacts. And so through speaking with my mentors, we went through several different models and tried to understand what the methodologies for other states were compared to New Jersey, what the national standards were. And we settled on figuring out how we could juxtapose the issue of cumulative impacts with the cultural ecosystem services model. And so essentially the cultural ecosystem services model is a tool that calculates impact and can show where the best solutions for environmental justice injustices can be resolved. And so those things can span from figuring out exactly what how often people have access to trees, or how many times people have the chance to go outside, where they walk for their daily walks, and using nature as a way to distress. And so throughout this project, I, as well as my mentors, helped to design a way to juxtapose the indicators for the New Jersey Environmental Justice Screening Tool EJ map with a series of specific constituents from the Cultural Ecosystem Services model, and design a way that we can overlay that as another layer to the EJ map tool, so that we can further decide how EJ screening tools can move forward in a more organized fashion, considering cumulative impacts. And so a great deal of this work was really surprising. I kind of changed direction in terms of instead of thinking about kind of the gloom and doom of a lot of the ways that many people constructing environmental justice screening tools do, me and my mentor shifted the conversation into trying to decide what are the solutions and how can we use these maps to place these solutions in areas where there is the most need. And so I spent a great deal of time kind of designing the figures and figuring out exactly how this will be written up. So it will be produced in a product of an academic paper that I hope to distribute widely and that you all get the chance to read. And just to close, I really think that the field of cumulative impacts and figuring out the solutions to these problems are really critical to understanding climate justice, environmental justice, energy justice, all types of injustices in the field of all of us. So I will introduce the next speaker, Jacqueline. So Jacqueline is doing a lot of work with Chinese Vietnamese refugees, and her intersectional advocacy and leadership was definitely brought into this fellowship. So I will let her take it away.
Thank you so much, Alexa. I always love listening to my cohort speak. So I will introduce myself. My name is Jacqueline Tan, but I go by Jax. I live in Bougainville, so I'm in New Orleans. And so much of this Climate Justice Design Fellowship was a surprise for me. I think about data constantly as a doctoral student in social work, but I also think about it as somebody who leads a nonprofit that works with a population that's less than 2% of a state, but is so much a part of the fabric of its industry and like all of the service that's woven through the history of this state. So the project that I worked on, I named Rooting Storms. It's an ongoing storytelling and data project that reimagines what data can be like. The vision of this project was really, how do I center community stories and voices? And I think initially I really wanted to use technology that would serve institutions and validate the existence and the unseen labor and displacement and the violent racism of environmental injustices of the community, specifically the Vietnamese community throughout New Orleans and the Gulf South. But as I was inquiring with the community and doing these assessments and engagement, I think a lot of trauma permeated. As somebody who has survived storms, as a child of refugees, and also somebody who works extensively with this community as a direct service worker, I began to understand that the points of inquiry needed to change. How do we witness and hold space for histories that aren't acknowledged? Some of those questions came up and really shifted the way in which I myself saw data equity. You know, I think there is a way of understanding narrative plenitude and Asian American stories as a part of defining the praxis of what it means to experience environmental racism and environmental displacement. And across cultural and generational lines, languages, and borders, I realized that through storytelling, there was something very healing, very profound that was happening. And full transparency, I'm a clinically trained social worker. So much of my approach is in understanding the complex trauma of the population and the communities that I've continued to work with. So I thought a lot about how we could redefine and really shift cultural assets. How do we really center cultural people as political people? How do we use these stories as data points and start story analysis to really create our own wealth and build advocacy tools for a population that is often overlooked? So what I found most surprising about my project was the very palpable rage and pain in the community. I think oftentimes when we're doing data equity work or climate work, we are able to remove it and create some distance. If it's something we observe, if it's something we witness through an exhibit, we seldom think about how painful it is to embody and live this, and think about how intersectional social change is something that's outside of us, right? And through this project and the storytelling, which is going to be continuous, as Jill has mentioned, this is really a seed. It was really an incubator of understanding what our greatest intentions are in a city and a region that is so violently and often affected by climate change that is happening now. So what was overwhelmingly surprising for me is just how we need to reckon with trauma that permeates data. You know, I think we have to think about not just competing with imperialism and colonialism that has created systems of oppression, but also thinking about how are we creating systems of storytelling, systems of remembering and processes that are regenerative, sustainable, and also honors the most impacted during the process of doing this work. I think a lot about how this is a living, breathing archive, and true data equity is about understanding how data can also be harnessed as a tool of great malice and benevolence, depending on who has this in its power and who's witnessing it. And so this is something that's an ongoing conversation and a project that I look forward to creating into a long-term program. I really want to thank Jill and my mentors, Nathan, and everybody that has touched the work, because I feel like it really, even though it's a fellowship and it was an individual project, the input that I've gotten from folks and the continuous community engagement is truly how it's been a powerful equity tool in it of itself. With that said, I'm going to introduce the next fellow, Jay. I'm really excited to hear about everything that's happening. We had a lot of crossover, and I feel like we are approaching it very differently, where I wanted to do the story maps, but the community was like, I want to tell the story. So now I'm going backwards. So I'm excited to hear about her work. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Drisha, go by Jay sometimes, located in Portland, Oregon. And so my project was basically intersecting community stories with heat dome data and tree canopy data. A lot of times we see studies that talk about the unprecedented effects of climate change and disproportionate impact on communities of color or frontline communities. But a lot of times those communities are not at the table when studies and things are being done. A lot of focus is on academia and government. So my plan was to try and make this data more accessible. And a lot of the ways that, at least I know my community receives information is with oral tradition and sharing of stories. We'll remember who needed to travel to get an AC or who borrowed such and such from someone during a heat dome event. And so that was the kind of data I was trying to capture from frontline community members. What was surprising to me during this fellowship was the power of partnerships. What started off as kind of an independent project on my own, utilizing my role in community. At the time I was a NAACP Portland EJ chair and served in a couple of volunteer spaces outside of my day job, transitioning into having new partnerships and people wanting to share these stories with trusted partners and trusted community leaders. And so utilizing those folks and making sure that whatever we talked to community with, it had a stipend. So it was surprising to me the importance of that. And then also the diversity of the data. As an engineer by day, sometimes I look at things in very technical terms of this is good data, this is not good data. And for community stories, I could not do that. The stories that people were sharing were from themselves. And a lot of them were very striking and deep and long stories. And some were just simple, one word. And I couldn't make that data say good or bad because that was somebody's story and I wanted to share it. So that was what was surprising, the diversity of those stories. And I was continually surprised at how much some folks did share. And it prompted the project to actually go into an expansion with some of our trusted partners in government, Multnomah County, and coalitions of communities of color, which is a local nonprofit in the Portland area that I've volunteered with for few years now. And our project is going to expand to include focus groups where people have more time to talk in a more one-on-one relationship, and maybe do recordings and potential opportunities for artistic sharing of these stories. So what started off as just a small data mapping project in this fellowship is now expanded into a future project and will inform actual policy within Multnomah County for the upcoming climate plan. So it's been really exciting to see this continue and to learn the data skills. I was never really very good at GIS, very basic, and now I know a lot more, and it's another tool I can use for advocacy and my volunteer work. So it's been surprising and fun. I want to thank my mentors and this great cohort of other fellows. I feel like I have a new network of folks, and it's been great to get to know them. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Laura Robinson, who's one of the fellows I was actually able to meet because I went to DC and we got to have lunch. And so I feel like I know her really well. She's a landscape architect, an arborist, and we've both been talking through our projects together because there are a lot of similarities. We're both looking at trees.
Thanks, Jay. It was wonderful to get to know you as well. So that is a wonderful part of this fellowship, is making these new connections. Hello, I'm Laura. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I work primarily in Prince George's County, which is the county right outside of Washington, D.C. And as an arborist and landscape designer for a community design-focused nonprofit, a lot of my work has been primarily with schools in the public school system in Prince George's County. And a pattern that I noticed working with all of these school communities is the want and need for climate resilient school grounds. And the support was always at the school level, and those communities were very strongly passionate about, getting more trees and more plants at their schools, but there was always pushback at different levels within the system. And when the burden falls on teachers who are already overworked, or the parents or the students themselves, it just doesn't work, and it's not fair. And so I went into this fellowship really focusing on climate resilience and how to continue those efforts. And it eventually evolved to focusing on trees. One, because that's what I know best. And two, because it's a much more tangible and high impact project to get these trees at schools. And so I really wanted to focus on two audiences, keeping that support for the individual school communities themselves. So, continuing to work with those teachers around curriculum and those school site-based planting projects and helping them get the trees so that students have access to it and understand and get that hands-on experience. But also focusing on the audience of the school system itself. So making sure that there's an understanding of what the existing landscape is. And so I kind of looked at two different variables with my map and understanding, what is the current canopy ratio on these school parcels, but then also what is the access like? So, some of these parcels are huge, but the students don't actually have access to it. So really understanding what those benefits are and how making this change for increasing tree canopy for the school system is the system's responsibility. And so I think that's something that I think was maybe a surprise for me is when I do work mostly, kind of at that individual community group level through my work, is just figuring out the different qualms that come with the system and getting focused in on how that data can help with that. So I think my project certainly shifted a little bit, but I'm excited to see where it can go now, a little bit without the pressure of some deadlines, and really bring in the individual communities as well as the system administrators themselves to see where this can go with a little room to breathe and things like that. So thank you so much. I'm excited that you all are excited about us, and I'm happy to announce or to send it off to Carlos, who is next. And he's an environmental justice advocate based in Philadelphia. And among many, many accomplishments, he's the City of Philadelphia Environmental Justice Advisory Commissioner. And I think you'll be so excited to hear about his project around blue lining.
Carlos, I think your audio might be muted. We're not hearing you.
Hello, can you hear me now? Yes.
Gotcha.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. And I was saying I'm humbled and very excited and inspired to be amongst all of you, to be part of this very special fellowship, and more importantly, be collaborating with the other fellows and learning about their work and what inspires them. I'm Carlos Clausel. I'm born and raised in Puerto Rico. I currently live in Philadelphia. And for my project, for the fellowship, there's a bit of a story tied to it. As I was reading certain articles, related to climate change, we're all in the climate equity, climate justice, environmental justice space. I stumbled upon a new term that kind of surprised me a little bit. The term is blue lining. And upon reading on these set of articles, it defined blue lining as the practice when banks, financial institutions begin to assess climate data, climate risk data, to help inform their practices, their policies, their financial tools and mechanisms, especially for the housing market, to use climate risk data to help inform property values, an assessment on property values, and to decide on mortgages and who gets access to mortgages, and on insurances, on housing insurance, especially houses that may be at a high risk when we think about the impacts of climate change. That term is also tied to another term, underwater writing, which is an internal practice within banks and financial institutions to use climate risk data to model different scenarios associated to the impacts of climate change and decide on mortgages, property values, and so forth. With that came the possibility of the identifying areas that are deemed too risky for investment, therefore labeled them blue line areas or blue line communities. And then the definition had an additional sentence, which meant the term is meant to be reminiscent of redlining. And I think for the sake of time, I think we all know what redlining is. I hope that all of you are aware of what redlining meant and the impact it has over people of color, especially Black communities. So with that, I decided to ask a set of questions and to better understand what blue lining as a concept meant, to help to try to identify the different layers that are associated to blue lining, because I am convinced and I believe that there's more to it, and to propose a definition that uses an equity lens and takes into account the communities that are at the front lines of climate change, of climate injustice, and communities of color. Through that process, I started a literature review, desktop research, and initial mapping assessment to identify or begin to identify the different layers that could be associated to blue lining, and propose a working definition that challenges that first definition that I just shared. And through the process, I decided on proposing the current definition. Blue lining, I believe, is an inequitable practice of using climate science and climate risk data to identify the geographies and neighborhoods that will be most impacted by natural climate hazards and label them climate sacrifice zones. 2, first, extract wealth using predatory schemes before enacting policies that discourage public and private investments and tank property values within those areas. The term is meant to be reminiscent of redlining, a product of institutionalized racism that restricted loan availability to homeowners in minority-dominated neighborhoods. One thing that was two things I want to highlight in terms of this process as part of the project. One was that I thought I was going to be more advanced at the beginning, and when I began to understand the different layers that are tied to the practice and the possible outcomes of using climate data, climate risk data, to decide on which areas, which neighborhoods, which communities will get to survive and have a chance of thriving, despite the impacts of climate change, and which communities might be labeled blue line communities. There are other practices that can be associated to, or directly or indirectly associated to the practice of blue lining, or how blue lining can be operationalized, that are not necessarily being taken into consideration right now. For example, once you identify an area or neighborhood that is deemed too risky, it's not about necessarily not investing or discouraging investment in those neighborhoods, which could lead to informality of those communities, but also try using mechanisms and practices to extract wealth before it comes a time in which the risk is too much to bear. That was an initial surprise, and we're seeing it through a current practice coming from federal and state local governments associated to buyouts, the buyouts program, in which external actors identify potential areas that can be bought out because of their recurrent risk to flood and other events, and decide to buy those properties out at a low value, extract as much revenue or income from now until a certain point, and then cash out when the federal or state or local government authorities decide to buy out those properties because they are too much of a risk. Another thing that came from this process is to understand that my project in this first phase needed to develop enough arguments, content, and understanding of what blue lining could be to start a conversation with social justice, environmental justice, and climate justice advocates and the broader community of practice, to better understand and to have a lengthy and deep conversation in terms of what blue lining could really mean towards communities of color and disadvantaged communities, and how can we enable strategies to prevent the disproportionate impacts over those communities. Thank you. We'll pass it on to, I believe, Jill or Nathan, because I know that the other fellows are not present. But I'm gonna yeah, Jill.
Yes, thank you. I'm here. It's been lovely listening to the projects. And again, Dominique Thomas, one of our fellows, can't be here today, but we wanted to take a chance to say a few more words about her project. Unfortunately, I can't bring the sort of same joy and energy that she brings to her work, but if you visit this portal, you can kind of see from the homepage there that the energy and the joy is really in that space and in that work. So she's the first fellow that I met. I've actually met only Carlos in person, but hopefully in the future that will change. And actually, it was just a quick get to know you call that I took at the Boston Public Library while I was visiting the environmental mapping exhibit. So it's kind of nice to bring this full circle. And I have to say that conversation left me very excited about her work, and I remain very excited. I sort of started as part of it rereading Octavia Butler, I think as many of us have in this craziness of these past years. And it's been really wonderful to be reading these Octavia Butler books and to be witnessing Dominique's project To Earthseed unfold. And it's been a process. She had these very strong 4 pillars to the project that she remained kind of steadfast and dedicated to. And there were hurdles. There were data hurdles for sure. There were mapping hurdles, but Dominique was really unflappable through the whole project. And with the help of a web developer, Boaz Sender, somehow made this whole thing happen. She produced such richness through the project by telling its history, by including a Sankofa, by narrating a walking tour through Harlem. I think we didn't imagine that the projects could take a sort of physical form, but she managed to bring this into the physical world. And even if you can't take the tour physically in space, it's just listening. She narrates it beautifully. She interviewed Black Harlemites, providing insight into what they had to say. She mapped key variables around asthma and heat vulnerability, again, with incredible context and critique. She referenced kind of fundamental histories of Harlem and of the neighborhood, creating a rich visuals, and really bringing this kind of sense of joy to the work. She calls it a labor of love for Harlem, and it's really palpable. And in her words, the project is strongly rooted in Harlem, and it explores the past, present, and future of the neighborhood through this intersectional lens of climate, abolition, and Afrofuturism. So it looks at the experiences of Black people living in Harlem, their lived-in experiences, whether they lived there their whole lives or they're recent immigrants to the neighborhood, how they engage with their natural environment and physical space, and really importantly, what are their visions for the future. And so from these visions, if those are the sort of seed of the project that we've been mentioning, the hope is to build out an oral and organizing orientation. Dominique's a strong organizer, and so she's building on her past experiences with oral histories and organizing to build power and to take sustained action in climate. So again, the work combines this Black feminist ecological lens with Afrofuturism to consider what climate reparation may look like in Harlem, and how this is a way to build power, community power, to win a climate future that's grounded in abolition and that's really for the people in Harlem. So I encourage you, enter the portal. It'll draw you in literally, and join Dominique on this kind of non-linear journey, which I have no doubts will continue and grow. And I think with that, Nathan will say a few words about Idalmis's work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jill. And it's a privilege for me to be able to share with you a little bit about the work that Idalmis Vaquero, our fellow, has done. I know she's very sorry not to be able to join us today directly, and I'm going to do my best to represent the amazing work that she's done. Idalmis is an environmental lawyer working at Communities for a Better Environment in California. She's an Equal Justice Works fellow there, and in that role, she's focused on advocating for the cleanup of the Exide battery recycling facility, which has affected many communities in California with toxic waste contamination, including her own hometown of Boyle Heights. So in her CJDF fellowship project, she has built on that work, and she has explored specifically the effects that hazardous waste contamination has on schools in California. She's been creating resources to help policymakers evaluate potential loopholes in state law that omit environmental review when considering where to put certain types of schools. And this can, of course, put children at risk of toxic waste exposure and create a significant public health hazard. And having seen Idalmis work with her mentors at the CJDF, I can tell you she brings a really tireless energy and a deep understanding of the needs of her community to this project. And this has really enabled her to put the insights that she's extracted from this data to a very impactful use. So she's approached this project by working together with our colleague, Jonathan Foster, and they've pulled data on all types of schools in California, public schools, private schools, and charter schools, and juxtapose that with the locations of hazardous waste sites throughout the state. So if you visit her website, which is linked on our climatefellowship.org page, you can see these maps that they've created. So in looking at where these hazardous waste sites and school projects are co-located, she's been able to identify what communities are experiencing the greatest risk from this toxic waste contamination. Excuse me. And she's made a persuasive case about how to improve this situation using a combination of policy changes directly to the environmental law and regulation, but also changes in land use planning and affordable housing-centered solutions that provide a more systemic response. So the website that she's built is ejhazardouswaste.com, and there she publishes a number of mapping tools that you can explore yourself, and she's written up reports with her own insights and visualizations of this issue. So I hope you'll take a look at Idalmis's website and an opportunity to learn a little bit more about how environmental justice can have direct impacts on the health and well-being of children and of all of our communities. And I want to thank Idalmis. So at this point, we're going to transition to have a little bit of a Q&A with our fellows. We welcome everyone to put questions into the chat on YouTube, and we'll be glad to share them with the fellows. I have the pleasure to be able to kick off the conversation. I'm going to go back to our first presenter, Alexa. Alexa, I wanted to ask you, you've identified this really powerful potential role of cumulative impacts in environmental justice and assessment. And I wanted to ask you if you have a perspective on why policymakers aren't already making greater use of cumulative impacts analysis. Alexa, I want to make sure, can you hear me? Are you there? Aha, no worries. Let me turn instead to Laura for the first question. Laura, I wanted to ask you, I know you have really intimate connections to many of the schools in Maryland, and I was wondering if you could share with us an example of maybe the most interesting or remarkable transformation that you've seen a school undergo or to begin in response to climate adaptation needs.
Yeah. So Maryland has something called Maryland Green Schools, and it's a certification your school can get. And this is something that you get. There's certain benefits you get if you're a Maryland Green School, but a lot of it is focused on like trash and recycling and things like that. But it's always one teacher that maybe it's because they have like a green thumb or they enjoy planting at home or something, that they usually kind of kick off the planting frenzy at their school. And there's one school, it's a high school, and it's in probably one of the older buildings that was built in the 70s and still has not really been updated. But he goes after every single tree opportunity that he can get. And with his students, I think he's planted over like 500 trees at the school. And, they don't all survive because the school grounds are not necessarily built to sustain trees everywhere. But I think it's just an example of the perseverance of just what one individual can do at the impact at their school. So that's someone that I love working with because he does, it's always like one dedicated teacher that really makes the difference with these school communities. And, when you can help them, get the ball rolling, it usually, it's really hugely impactful, and they can bring in the rest of the school as well.
Thank you so much, Laura. I love that story. I find nothing more inspiring than hearing about the impact that educators can have on the students they work with and on their communities. So thank you. Alexa, I wanted to turn to you. I was wondering if you could share a perspective on why cumulative impacts assessment, which I think you've made a persuasive case is so important, isn't already a bigger part of the policymaking regime around environmental justice.
Yeah, that's a large problem, mainly because we don't really know how to tackle it. The algorithms that are being designed right now are really experimental, and so the policymaking behind cumulative impacts is also really new. It's just kind of like a wicked problem. When the development of environmental justice screening tools kind of started several years ago, the idea of cumulative impacts was kind of difficult because to think of public health and the multiple factors that come into kind of an individual's life, that's kind of difficult to quantify, especially spatially. We're using census tract data, so that makes it all the more difficult whenever there are gaps. And so everything is brand new. Specifically, California has been kind of spearheading the cumulative impact methodology space. And it was my hope through this project, and kind of is now coming to fruition, that I could add to that kind of knowledge base. So everything is brand new. Cumulative impacts are really a wicked problem. And when it comes to environmental justice screening tools, we're definitely moving forward, and there are solutions, and the way that we think about the issue is a lot more solution based, but there's a lot of work to be done, and Justice 40 kind of set that off.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate your calling out the real underlying technical and research challenges. So we're really grateful for your work in pushing forward methodologies in this space. So thank you, Alexa. I'll turn to Jax next. Jax, you described for us how powerful, how personal, how emotional the stories that you're capturing through your work can be. And I was wondering if you can shed a little light for us on what motivates someone to share something that's that intimate and intense. What benefits do they get in working with you in your project?
I think this is something that Jill mentioned early on too. So much of this work is about trust, right? Trusting institutions, trusting folks, and even as Alexa was mentioning census, on my day job, I work in civic engagement and intersections of reproductive justice and environmental justice here in Louisiana. And so often, like, all work is trust-based work. I tell philanthropy all the time, it doesn't matter if you want to fund environmental justice issues or reproductive justice issues. If you don't have the trust of the community, it will not work. You just can't moneyball your way into folks voting in their own interest even, right? It's really about conversations. And I think for me, what engaged folks in wanting to talk about this was Hurricane Ida. Like, when you realize the infrastructure is not there and the community is all we have to understand we have to take care of one another. And I think living in New Orleans and having survived quite a few storms myself, one of the most powerful things I realized is that when you really feel like nobody is coming for you, you really have to build your own ecosystem and community of care. And so I had one storyteller who had such a profound impact on me because she was born on a refugee camp. She had, she's in her 40s. She had survived Katrina, Andrew, Betsy, Ida, and she still lives here. And I think one of the biggest things in my project, Rooting Storms, was this idea of like, what drives displacement? What is that texture of being Asian American in New Orleans and the Gulf South feel like? And what does it look like in such a binary space? And so I definitely also oversampled folks who often don't have a chance to be witnessed or tell their stories. And I really wanted to remove the institutional gaze. I really wanted them to tell the stories for themselves. So I oversampled non-binary, LGBTQIA, Asian Americans, queer folks that we work with normally, folks that we continue to have relationships with, because I feel like their stories are the most important ones, to be very honest, because when the storm hits, those are the folks that are out there feeding our community, feeding other communities, and building bridges. And it's a practice of trust, right? I think when you say, what do folks get out of sharing their stories? I didn't pay anybody. And I think one of the most surprising things my mentor said was, you didn't give anybody a Starbucks gift card, Amazon gift card, anything? I was like, I think there's something very extractive about this like transactional exchange, right? I think there's some deep mutuality in witnessing somebody and holding space for their pain and knowing that I don't have the capacity to fix it. I don't have the capacity to heal it, but there's something very innately healing about holding and seeing somebody and saying, hey, I see that you're suffering and I'm with you, and I think that's one of the most powerful parts of this system and this creation of data equity. How do we harness knowing and understanding something and then advocating for folks, even if there are not a lot of us, even if we are speckled throughout the state in different ways, our stories still matter. And there's a level of representation that you can weave through narrative plenitude and understanding what that feels like, and it's contextualized outside of trauma as well. And Nathan, I just want to mention before I wrap this up, you're the one who pointed out to me, a trauma therapist, that, oh, you don't mention the explicit words trauma. And it really hit me how traumatized I was doing this project, because I was like, oh no, I don't want to talk about trauma anymore. I don't want to think about, you want data equity to be about numbers oftentimes. You want it to be quantitative. You want to prove in so many ways. When you live in Louisiana, you want to prove pain, and you're scared of people not believing you because you gaslit yourself for so long. And so I think naming trauma and understanding that there's this post-traumatic growth, and yes, resilience is not enough in the lack of infrastructure, but there's something to be said about the deep ancestral mutuality that folks share, regardless if you're Filipino, Vietnamese, Chinese, Black, white. There's something very powerful about understanding the universality of our suffering and how we can take care of one another.
Jax, you always speak beautifully about this topic, and the thing that's impressed me the most in working with you is how you always center the individuals in your community and make sure that sharing their story is something that is supportive for them. So thank you for commenting on that. Let me turn next to Jay. Jay, I was wondering if you can share with us a little bit about people's pre-existing awareness of tree canopy issues when you encounter them. I'm wondering if people are aware of disparities between maybe their community and the one next door in terms of tree canopy coverage and how that affects their lives.
So they weren't at first, but in June of 2021, we had our unprecedented heat temperatures where we were at like 116 degrees, and then paved areas were much hotter. And community didn't start realizing that until they started noticing that other places were actually more cool than others. So when I asked these canopy questions, a lot of them were like, we don't have a park in my neighborhood. And they just noticed that. Like, they're very aware about that. And then also noting that the tree canopy areas in Portland are being used differently. We have a houseless crisis in Portland right now. And so many of our responses talked about the parks that did exist were being utilized as housing and didn't feel accessible that way. But then a lot of our cooling shelters that were meant to handle some of the hot spots in Portland weren't accessible either, because you couldn't bring animals. And they told us a lot more about canopy, maybe not in the words tree canopy and dwindling and changes to their tree canopy, but they knew where there were trees and where there were not, and that it felt hotter to them. And I think that is new because of how extreme of the heat event we had.
Thank you for calling that out. It's amazing to see how a community's mindset can shift in response to a climactic event like that. Unfortunately, I'm sure all of us will be experiencing more of those with time. And it's really interesting to see how your work fits in with that and builds, in turns a really extreme weather event into something that can make positive change in a community. So we have time for one more question, and I see someone has left one in the chat for Carlos. So Carlos, I'd like to put this to you. So the question is, it's just interesting to think about the overlays between red-lined and blue-lined neighborhoods. Do you see a tool for public agencies to direct resilience efforts?
I think yes. The answer is yes. But before that, I think there are things that need to be better understood and clarified in terms of the outcome. I'm sorry, I'm dealing with a sick baby here. The results, the outcomes of the practices that will operationalize blue lining. We're talking about the housing market, the impacts of climate change, the potential issues of displacement and forcing communities into informality by enabling policies that will disencourage investment in disadvantaged communities that are the front lines of climate change. So when you look at that, you need to understand that this is a housing issue, a justice issue, but it also impacts public health, wealth inequality. And one thing that came from the literature review is really interesting is looking at the 20. There was a study that I assessed that highlights the 21 indicators for inequality, which establishes the different set of metrics and variables that are subjected to inequality from a climate change or a climate disaster standpoint. And I think that understanding the impact of climate change, since it's something that hasn't fully happened, it's beginning to brew. And when it continues to become operationalized, understanding the different scenarios that will come as expected outcomes from operationalizing blue lining will help to inform a potential tool that will help stakeholders, whether it's government, advocates, communities, community-based organizations, institutions, academia, and even the financial and banking sectors as well.
Great. Well, we're nearly at the top of the hour. So before I turn it back to Nathan and Jill to close the program, I first of all want to say a huge thanks to the fellows for joining. It's been an absolute joy to hear about all of your projects, but also to invite everybody listening to spend some more time exploring the fellows' work in greater depth. You can do that, of course, by visiting the Climate Fellowship website at climatefellowship.org. But for those of you who are in the Boston area, I'd love to invite you to come by the Central Library in Copley Square at any time to see the sort of exhibition on display, which I think speaks to two themes that run through the fellows' work as well as through our environmental justice exhibition. One of those is a recognition that climate justice issues are both profoundly localized and place-specific. They refer to the accumulated injustices and spatial arrangements of different cities and neighborhoods, but they're also interwoven across space and time. So although our exhibition, for instance, focused largely on Boston studies, the themes, issues, and kind of threads of environmental change, of course, resonate with many of these fellows projects from other cities. And the other is that we feel really strongly, as I know the Harvard team and all the fellows do, that climate mapping and data and advocacy is at its most powerful when it's not limited to specialists and bureaucrats and data scientists and GIS technicians, but when it's accessible and usable and in fact made, co-produced by members of the public from all walks of life. As a very public space that welcomes everyone from kids in strollers all the way through community activists to our facilities and programs here at the Central Library. We're really looking forward to having members of the public engage with the fellows' work in this way. And the Harvard team will accompany the digital exhibition with some parallel information and some opportunities to provide the fellows with feedback about their projects. So Jill and Nathan, I'll turn it back to you to close today's program.
Thank you so much. We'll conclude very briefly just by giving thanks to some of the people and groups that made all this work possible. First, let me just thank you, Garrett and Megan, for inviting us to share our work with the Leventhal Center and your community today. It's been a pleasure. I want to thank George and the Salata Institute again for welcoming us to this session, for supporting all of our work in our program. I want to thank the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard, which has housed our program. Gary King, Alyssa Goodman, and the staff there have been terrific partners. And I want to thank some of our technical supports, some of the organizations that we have shown you some of their work today. Buku Consulting, MRW Consulting helped us with some of our web development. Glue Solutions helped us with much of our data visualization and analysis work, and the Data Commons project helped us with data access and thinking about data as well. Jill, can I turn to you?
Yeah, I'll just add a thank you to Boaz Sender, who also did some web development for us, to our mentors. We had 14 amazing mentors who supported these projects, and to the fellows themselves. It's really been a pleasure. I could listen to you talk all day, but also I know that you're not talking all day. You're out there doing really amazing stuff. So keep doing what you're doing. And thank you so much for sharing. This has been wonderful.